Hello, namaste, a very good evening, and welcome to the Festival of Bharat. My name is Sharan Citti, and I'll be your host for this program. Joining us today for a conversation is a very well known author, thinker, critic, Mr. Ashwin Sanghi. Ashwinji, thank you so much. Namaste. It's a great privilege to have you here on our platform. It's your first
Thank
time,
you,
that too.
Sharan. I'm delighted to be here.
Ashwinji, how have you been? And it's a very impressive collection of books behind you, and that sort of sets the atmosphere for you to write in, perhaps. Huh?
Absolutely, Sharan. For me, this is my study. You can't see the rest of it. There
Yeah.
are about three walls and a window in front of me, but the three walls around me are entirely packed with books.
Right.
And this is my sacred space. Most days I'm here between 5 o'clock in the morning and 9 o'clock in the morning. So these
Right.
are the 3 or 4 hours when I normally get through all of my writing for the
Right.
day. So in that sense, it's a very sacred space.
That is where the magic happens.
We hope that the magic happens, yes.
Ashwinji, let me begin with my first question. You've also been writing about politics, foreign affairs, and national security. And these are something I wanted to ask you because generally you're also asked about many of your books that you've written, but we'll also come to that later.
Sure.
In your column, you've also written about secularism. And if we look at the recent events, what are happening in India with the hijab rav, etc., secularism as a definition, as a concept, is being challenged and is being questioned, rather, because we essentially happen to be a plural society without needing any validation from the others. And in your column, you've written about the dharmic path to secularism, and I was very interested to know more about this, particularly because of the entire hijab rav that is happening. And if you've looked at the opposing counsel in the High Court, which is the hearing is happening right now, he's used a very interesting term called positive secularism, and that the Modi government is using negative secularism somehow to differentiate what is happening in India. So I just wanted to pick your brains on this.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's probably the topic of the times, Sharan. Really think about this. What does really the word secular mean? I mean, if we really think about it, strictly speaking, secularism implies separation in entirety of the church and state. And in a secular nation, the government must stay away from anything that is remotely religious. But it's very odd to my mind that the word secular was not part of the preamble to the Indian Constitution when it was originally adopted. And why was such an important word left out? To my mind, the omission was deliberate. What is even more surprising is that the two people who actually guided the drafting of the preamble, that is Ambedkar and Nehru, their so-called secular credentials were unimpeachable.
Right.
So to be secular in the truest sense of the word, the Indian state would have to stay out of the religious ambit completely.
Right.
And frankly, in the Indian context, Sharan, it was impossible. How could Indian courts recognize Sharia-based Muslim personal law while claiming to be secular? How could central and state governments take over the management of Hindu temples if they were secular? How could a secular government provide financial assistance to educational institutions run by religious organizations? How would a secular government codify and modify Hindu personal law? How would the government extend, for example, the existing caste-based reservations to minority religions if it was secular? So these were some of the actions which would clearly fall outside the remit of a secular nation. And the writers of the preamble realized that it was better not to use the term rather than to use it dishonestly. So the word secular only creeps into the Constitution in the emergency years in 1975 through an ordinance. Now, the question that I want to really ask today is that did the insertion of the word secular in 1975 imply that India had not been secular before 1975-76? Had the omission of the word turned India into a so-called Hindu Rashtra? The answer to that is not at all. I mean, by leaving the word out of the preamble, the fathers of the constitution were making it incumbent on Hindus to remember their commitment to the Upanishads' ideal of Vasudeva Kutumbakam, that the world is one family. The framers of the constitution were subtly saying that the Indian ethos is essentially Hindu in character, but the ethos also implies an ingrained respect for and a tolerance of all faiths. So secularism in the Indian context would not mean that the state was going to remain away from religion. Instead, it would maintain equidistance from all religions. Unfortunately, Sharan, you and I both know that that equidistance did not happen. Over the years, the test of secularism came to be whether India's minorities were perceiving an action as secular or not. For example, the government gave very little control of its of the functioning of the Central Waqf Council or the church-related institutions, but it exercised incredible control over Hindu temples. Nehruji decided to pass the 4 Hindu code bills while abandoning the objective of a uniform civil code. Even in politics, we saw for the early decades, it was very common to be seeking Muslim votes by appealing to the Imam of Jama Masjid, but appealing to Hindu seers was considered communal. Speaking up for minority rights was noble, but very few were willing to speak for the Kashmir's abandoned Pandits. So frankly, this no longer felt like secularism. It was selectivity. And unfortunately, it is this particular selectivity that has created the so-called far right or the fringe right, where you have all sorts of obnoxious statements emerging from. So for a minute, let's not think of India, but let's think of Bharat. So for a minute, Sharan, let's not think of India, but think of this ancient land that we call Bharat. It prided itself on providing sanctuary to others. The Zoroastrian refugees fleeing Muslim persecution in Iran were provided a home in Gujarat by a Hindu king, Jadi Rana. And similarly, if you look at the St. Thomas Christians, they were provided a home in Kerala. The first Jewish refugees settled over 2 millennia ago on the Malabar coast, and a second wave arrived pursuant to their expulsion from Iberia in the 15th century. So when Buddhist monks were being butchered by the People's Liberation Army of China, India welcomed the Dalai Lama along with thousands of Buddhists. The country accepted millions of refugees from Bangladesh during the 1971 genocide. The Baghdadi Jews and the Bene Israel from Pakistan were sheltered in India. So that spirit of refuge was intrinsic to India's dharmic values. We did not need a constitutional amendment to make us secular. Dharmic thought, frankly, is essentially plural. It embraces multiple truths. 33 million deities can be part of that same family. Jesus Christ can be incorporated on the facade of a Hindu temple, and the Buddha can be absorbed as an avatar of Vishnu. You can be an Astic or a Nastic, a Shaivite or a Vaishnavite, a vegetarian or a carnivore, a fire worshipper, idol worshipper, nature worshipper. You may worship Shiva, Shakti, or a combination of both. You may see the path to enlightenment as yantra, tantra, mantra, or none of the above. You may hold that the Shivling is a stone, and I may hold that it's a Shivling. Both of us are welcome. We can have 300 versions of an epic called Ramayana, but your version does not negate mine. All religions are seen as paths to the divine. Unfortunately, Abrahamic ideology attempts to impose a singular truth on a plural world. There is only one true God who will punish you if you are evil. But if you obey his word and follow his orders scrupulously, you may save yourself from the hellfires of damnation. When one couples that absolutism with expansionism and proselytizing, then one has all the ingredients for a conflict. Hinduism is one of the few Bronze Age, pre-Bronze Age actually, cultures to have survived to this day. Do you see Zoroastrianism thriving in Iran? What happened to the Mithraic cults of Rome? What happened to Ra, Osiris, and Horus of the Egyptians? What happened to Zeus, Apollo, and Athena of the Greeks? What happened to the tribal belief systems and languages of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia? Most pagan belief systems and cultures could not withstand the onslaught of Abrahamic thought, but Hinduism survived against all odds. And that's why I think that it is our duty to preserve that legacy. Now, of course, you cannot hold present-day Muslims or Christians responsible for acts of history or the past that they had nothing to do with.
Right.
But what is very important is truth and reconciliation. And necessarily, truth must come before reconciliation. Truth begins with acknowledging the past. We did not allow that to happen. If we really think that India's secularism is going to be challenged by a Ram temple in Ayodhya or a hijab ban in schools or a ban on triple talaq, they should realize that India is secular primarily because of its Hindu ethos. In most Muslim majority countries, Islamization eventually creeps in. Just look at the 49 Muslim majority countries around the world, and you will realize that the only way to preserve secularism is by preserving Hindu syncretism. We are very proud of this, what we call the Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb of India. For every Bhimsen Joshi, there is a Zakir Hussain. For every Vikram Sarabhai, there is an Abdul Kalam. For every Shashi Tharoor, there is a Salman Rushdie. But ask yourself this very important and fundamental question. Why did this Ganga Jamuna syncretism not take root in Pakistan or Bangladesh? The answer is the underlying Hindu spirit that simply cannot be ignored. Do you really want to preserve secularism in India? Then first preserve the Hindu ethos. That's what I mean by the dharmic path to secularism.
Very wonderfully explained, and I'm sure the last two bits are going to go crazy viral on YouTube for sure. So what you're essentially trying to say is that we do not necessarily need a Westphalian system to ensure that there is secularism in India, because as a civilization, we have always been tolerant of other faiths and other communities coming and seeking refuge in India. Points very well noted, Ashwinji. Thank you so much for that. Now to my most favorite part of the interview, where I get to ask you about Chanakya, because I shouldn't be saying this probably on camera, but I'm a huge admirer of Chanakya's chant and all your other works.
You are too sweet, and you're making me feel very elated right now.
No, I think you deserve to be elated. So Ashwinji, I've read Chanakya's chant at least thrice, and I've also read Chanakya's Arthashastra from the security of from the National Security Prism while I was doing my master's. So there's a lot of interaction that happens. Now, Chanakya is somebody, if India had not rediscovered his works, we wouldn't have known about the glories of our past at all, and the strategies that he wrote thousands of years ago. This is something of a dream that you can't even think of, essentially. So given your study of Chanakya and Arthashastra, how relevant do you think Chanakya is and Arthashastra is to today's India, especially since we face a lot of geopolitical competition?
Sure. I mean, I've always maintained that our country forgot Chanakya, we forgot Kautilya, we forgot the Arthashastra, whereas China remembered Sun Tzu. And I think that is one very important distinction between these two countries. But since the question is specifically around Chanakya, well, we all know that Kautilya, or this individual called Vishnugupta, was amongst India's greatest strategists, economists, and statesmen. His writings, of course, include the Arthashastra and the Niti Shastra, and they are variously quoted by gurus, politicians, diplomats. But this man, born somewhere around 375 BCE, is believed to have devised the diplomatic, political, and military and economic strategy by which Chandragupta was able to seize power and fashion the mighty Mauryan Empire. In fact, Chanakya is probably India's first political scientist and economist. So it is a puzzle as to why we have forgotten him. And why do we also, Sharan, this really bugs me, why do we condescendingly call him the Indian Machiavelli? After all, Niccolo Machiavelli lived around 1850 years after Chanakya. and his political treatise, The Prince, does not even cover a fraction of Chanakya's intellectual landscape.
Correct.
Now, this apathy could be attributed to the fact that the Arthashastra remained lost in the sands of time for many centuries after the decline of the Mauryan Empire. And it was only in 1904 that Dr. Shama Shastri transcribed and translated the work and made it available to the entire world. And suddenly the world rediscovered Chanakya and his wisdom. But until then, India's British rulers had assumed that our native ideas of governance in India had been borrowed from the Greeks. The rediscovery of Chanakya is what put paid to those notions.
Right.
But what did we do with Chanakya's wisdom after we rediscovered it? Unfortunately, very little. For example, take Chanakya's views on taxation. Chanakya says, just as one plucks fruits from a garden as they ripen, so shall a king have the revenue collected as it becomes due. Just as one does not collect unripe fruits, he shall avoid taking tax that is not due, because that will make the people angry and spoil the very sources of revenue. Now, these were words penned 2,300 years ago. But ask any Indian entrepreneur or foreign investor, and they will tell you that the biggest obstacle to Indian growth are complicated taxation policies, arbitrary orders, and incompetent tax administration. So, over the past few decades, we Indians have almost become thick-skinned when confronted by scams and corruption. But 2 millennia ago, Chanakya was cognizant of the problem. He wrote, just as it is impossible to know when a fish moving in water is drinking it, so it is impossible to find out when government servants in charge of undertakings misappropriate money. But Chanakya did not stop at simply recognizing the problem. Instead, he devised several checks and balances to minimize it. For example, he mandated that government officials should not be relatives of the king. That would enable the monarch to quickly punish officers when they indulged in malpractice. Each government department was required to maintain a profit center account, submit to an annual audit, and follow a uniform accounting year of 354 days. Remember, this was 2 millennia ago. I mean, It is truly fascinating. Sometimes the Arthashastra, since you've read it, reads almost like an ancient day McKinsey report. You know,
It does.
In your geopolitical sphere, Chanakya was way ahead of us with his Rajmandala theory. Your neighbor is your natural enemy, and your neighbor's neighbor is your friend. And just observe India's neighborhood, and you would instantly see the importance of his words. It was in the context of Rajamandala that Chanakya outlined his strategies of Sam, Dam, Bhed, and Dand. He had advised that the first method always that should be applied should be Sam or conciliation, gentle persuasion, praise. If that doesn't work, then move on to Dan, rewards, gifts, monetary benefits, sometimes even bribes. Next, one could employ stealth, intelligence, propaganda, and covert operations, which is Bhed. And finally, if all options are exhausted, then one employs Dand or force, military action and punishment. So Chanakya was unabashed about not being too idealistic or rigid in one's principles. There is no point in being too upright, he wrote. You would see by going to the forest that straight trees are cut down while the crooked ones are left standing. So, I mean, there is a certain amount of realpolitik to what Chanakya was talking about.
Right.
But even beyond governance, the principles of the Arthashastra can be applied to modern management almost seamlessly. For example, Chanakya said, a king can reign only with the help of others. One wheel alone does not move a chariot. Does that sound familiar? I mean, remember Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, who said great things in business are never done by one person. They are done by a team of people. I mean, in that sense, the concepts have not changed. The intrinsic value of teamwork shines through Chanakya's words. Take another management idea, that of time. Chanakya says, time perfects all living beings as well as kills them. Time alone is awake when all others are asleep. Even a minute of one's life cannot be obtained, even for 1,000,000 gold coins. If time is not used purposefully, what loss is bigger than that? I mean, it could almost be the words of a modern management theorist. While the world remembers Chanakya as the shrewd and ruthless tactician, we seem to have forgotten his contribution to the idea of good governance. The word Arthashastra is a combination of two words, Artha and Shastra. The former, of course, means wealth or well-being. The latter means science. So the resultant word actually denotes the science of prosperity, the science of well-being. And there is virtually no aspect of state administration that Chanakya does not address. He defines the daily routine of the monarch, civil and criminal penalties, operations of the secret service, tax structure, width of chariot roads, mining, organization structure of government, animal husbandry, agriculture, bureaucratic employment rules, consumer protection laws, judicial procedures, disaster management, property rights, infrastructure development, drainage, you name it, he's covered it. With all his pragmatism and ruthlessness, however, one thing must be not forgotten, Sharan, that there is a nobility of purpose that shines through in Chanakya's world. Much before philanthropy and corporate social responsibility became buzzwords, Chanakya explained it is essential for stagnant water to have a little flow for its purity, and it is necessary to donate part of one's wealth for its protection. And finally, he went on to say, and this is the most important bit, my favorite line from Chanakya's teachings: in the happiness of his subjects lies the king's happiness. In their welfare, his welfare. He shall not consider as good only that which pleases him, but treat as beneficial to him whatever pleases his subjects. I really wish we could take some words out of the Arthashastra and actually implement them as part of our policy. Even though they are 2,300 years old, they are still very, very relevant even to the present.
Absolutely. I mean, whenever I interact with my peers who are into China studies, you see, I hear a lot of anecdotes about Sun Tzu and other philosophers, but somehow we have lost that pride in our own history and in our own strategic thinkers of the past, you know. And somehow people like you are popularizing their works and at least getting kids interested into that. Like, I remember the first time I seriously took, I mean, this was way long back when I was a teenager. I took Chanakya very seriously and I wanted to read more about him was through your book. And thank you for all the seva that you've done through your writings.
Thank you, Sharan. I'm glad that I was able to prompt you or encourage you in a certain direction. I have always maintained that any of my books written in the Bharat series should be treated as a pretty much as a starting point of a journey. And that's the reason why I spent so much time building up the bibliography and the references in my, what are otherwise, normally in fiction thrillers, you don't see references.
Right.
But I always provide you with references in my thrillers. The reason being because there are so many people who get interested in a subject. I would really like them to be able to dig deeper and go into the very sources that I utilized in order to get there.
Right.
So one of the, like for example, Chanakya's chant, the primary resources were Arthashastra and the Mudra Rakshas. So I would ideally like people to go back to those works and look at them.
Extremely interesting. While we are discussing geopolitics as well, it is only imperative that we also discuss about Kashmir, because Kashmir has seen a lot of developments in the recent past, at least. You've also written in one of your columns about the distinction between Prime Minister Modi's approach to handling Kashmir as opposed to how Prime Minister Vajpayee was handling it. What differentiates the both of them?
Well, I mean, we all know now the late Atal Bihari ji had coined that doctrine which said Insaniyat, Jamhuriyat, and Kashmiriyat. And of course, the former Prime Minister was talking about the three pillars that would define his Kashmir policy. And those would be humanity, democracy, and syncretism. And of course, rightly so, Vajpayee ji's remarks, they found resonance in all quarters, and his words continue to be repeated by successive governments. But unfortunately, I don't know, somehow I feel that they were more idealistic than pragmatic or real. Frankly, first of all, the generosity of spirit that was expressed through Vajpayee's doctrine resulted in, of course, the Lahore bus trip, which was repaid to us through the Kargil War and the IC-814 hijack and the attack on Indian Parliament. And of course, subsequently, Manmohan Singh ji also undertook the Srinagar and Muzaffarabad bus service, which was repaid with 2611. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's own surprise Lahore stopover to meet Nawaz Sharif in 2015 was repaid with Uri, Pathankot, and Pulwama. So, should we ask ourselves whether the doctrine which was proposed by Vajpayee ji was realistic? And so, if we look at the first part of that doctrine, which is insaniyat or humanity. Now, the word humanity itself is derived from the Latin word humanitas, meaning human nature and kindness. But insaniyat has been missing from the region for a long, long time. Some estimates indicate that around 60,000 people have died from 1989 to 2020 during this insurgency. But the numbers, the quantitative stuff, masks the horror of each death. As there is a famous quote, and it is attributed, actually misattributed to Stalin, which says, the death of one man is a tragedy, but the death of millions is a statistic. Think about, let's go back to 1990. I'm just giving you particularly a single example. There was a Kashmiri Pandit called Ashok Kumar Kazi, and he was shot dead. But before he died, his knees were shattered, his hair was plucked out, and his body was urinated on. As recently as 2017, an Indian police officer, Muhammad Ayub Pandit, was lynched by a mob of 200 people outside the Jamia Masjid. He was stripped naked and beaten with stones and iron rods. His body was recovered in a mutilated state. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, where is insaniyat to be found in this insanity? It is more insanity than insaniyat. Then let's take up the next pillar of Vajpayee ji's doctrine, which is Jamhuriyat. Now, the word Jamhuriyat is actually from the Ottoman Turkish word, which is Jamhuriyat. That means a republic or a democracy. Now, of course, we love to be reminded by certain people that India had a commitment to a Kashmiri plebiscite, but they conveniently omit mentioning that the so-called UN Resolution 47 required that Pakistan withdraw all its nationals as a precondition, which was a withdrawal that never happened. And the funny thing, and this really strikes me as odd, the very politicians who are now crying hoarse about the so-called murder of democracy through the repeal of Article 370 and the downgrading of the state to a union territory were content to rig the J&K Legislative Assembly elections in cahoots with Delhi on multiple occasions in the past. And remember also that prior to the repeal of Article 370, the Valmiki community was resigned to a life of sweeping and sanitation. They were denied permanent residence, voting rights, access to higher education or government jobs. So the question that you have to ask yourself is, were the Valmikis not entitled to Jamhuriyat also? So that leaves us with the final pillar, which is Kashmiriyat, implying a supposed tradition of communal harmony and religious syncretism in the region. But what happened a few months ago? I mean, I'm going to mention a few names that I remember: Makhanlal Bindru, Supinder Kaur, Virinder Paswan, Deepak Chand. These were all Hindu targets being killed. It reminds one eerily of the 1990s, in which hit lists of Kashmiri Pandits were being circulated while local newspaper ads were exhorting the community to either leave or to convert to Islam. Where was Kashmiriyat hiding when threatening slogans from the loudspeakers of mosques forced thousands of Pandits to flee their homes? Of around 75,000 Kashmiri Pandit families, more than 70,000 fled in those 2 years between 1990 and 92 alone. But the process, frankly, did not start in the 1990s or in 1989. As far back as 1931, anti-Hindu sentiments had been whipped up, leading to the region's first major riot. It was done to destabilize Maharaja Hari Singh's Dogra monarchy, and the beneficiary of that polarization was Sheikh Abdullah. So looking at today's Muslim majority Kashmir Valley, it is easy to forget that Kashmir was part of the Maurya Empire and then the Kushan Empire before falling to the Huns and then the Karakotas, the Utpalas and the Loharas. One forgets that the land derived its name from the goddess Kashmira and the sage Kashyap. One forgets that it was a thriving Buddhist and Shaivite culture until Sikandar Shah decided to forcibly Islamize it. There is an often repeated opinion that the problems of Kashmir are related to the decline of tolerant Sufi traditions and the rise of intolerant Salafism. But these observers obscure one very important fact, Sharan. The fact is that Sikandar Shah's Islamic zeal was itself inspired by a Sufi preacher, Mir Muhammad Hamdani. So does it even make sense then to talk of a historical Kashmiriyat? So the question that then I asked myself is that if Insaniyat, Jamhuriyat and Kashmiriyat cannot be the basis for lasting peace, then what should be? And amongst the so-called woke, left, liberal, secular lobby, they love Urdu. So I decided that I will find my own Urdu words in order to explain what is going on in Kashmir right now. So let me propose 3 new Urdu buzzwords to replace the old ones: Maishat, Hifazat, and Abadiyat. Economy, security, demography. Create economic prosperity and employment. Focus on internal and external security, and encourage migration into the region from other parts of India. That's exactly the Kashmir policy that I would like to see. But to my mind, this is pretty much the policy that the government seems to be working on already.
Right. Wonderfully said. And in fact, even that is being challenged, especially with the migrant workers being targeted off late. So, it somehow seems that there is a force, although they have neutralized a lot of terrorists in the recent past, the challenge certainly seems to be there, at least from a security perspective, from whatever interactions I've done with generals who've served there. They don't see this particular issue of terrorism as something that is going to get resolved anytime soon. It's going to be there. Perhaps the degree to which violence takes place can be, contained to a very large extent if there is a effective policy in place. And I think the statistics can only make sense after a few years, right?
Absolutely.
We're just living through the reforms right now.
Absolutely.
And history is something very, very interesting, and perspectives can become narratives depending on who is sanctioning them, who is writing them, etc. So what is your view on the existing historical narratives and the furor caused by those who challenge these existing narratives?
So my good friend Vikram Sampath is under attack these days.
Yes.
On account of his Veer Savarkar work. And it's just a perfect example of how threatened a certain section feels as a result of the fact that their narrative is challenged. And why only India? Last year, around the Western world, we saw a spate of statues being pulled down. For example, a statue of the Confederate Robert Lee and the British slave trader Edward Colston were the first to go. If you remember, during that entire episode where George Floyd's death had happened. Then in Antwerp, a statue of King Leopold of Belgium was pulled down. And he was, of course, the one who oversaw the systematic killing of millions in Belgian-run Congo. But unlike the statues of Joseph Stalin or Saddam Hussein that were knocked down many years ago in Hungary and Iraq, the new targets this time in the last year or two have been people who have been treated rather well by history, depending upon who narrated that version of history. Mahatma Gandhi, Robert Clive, Winston Churchill, Christopher Columbus, all of these have been treated quite nicely in history. So, truth be told, Sharan, pulling down a statue is relatively easy. What is far more difficult is presenting a historical counter-narrative to the one that has been force-fed over generations. And I think in this context, William Dalrymple had something very interesting to say in one of his articles. He said, in Britain, the study of the empire, the British Empire, is largely absent from the history curriculum. Now
Right.
more than ever, we badly need to understand what is common knowledge elsewhere, that for much of history, we were an aggressively racist and expansionist force responsible for violence, injustice, and war crimes on every continent. Tough words, very, very tough words. But I mean, this is precisely the point, that you ask the average English student, and they have not even been taught about what the English did as part of their entire colonial past. Now, this is really where the challenge lies, not just in Britain, but in most nations. History can very easily be manipulated by leftists, rightists, whites, blacks, conservative, liberals, Hindus, Muslims, Catholics, you name it, capitalists, socialists, communists, जो भी है, कुछ भी उस पे label डाल दो, there is a possibility of manipulation. The purpose, of course, is to erase their past sins or to glorify their own deeds. Removing statues will not correct those narratives. But the funny thing is that history is always seen as a part of that so-called liberal arts curriculum. And the word liberal itself comes from the Latin word liberalis, which means free. The end of World War II resulted in several Western democracies that called themselves liberal. The values encompassed within that broad term included individual rights, it included democracy, free markets, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, gender equality, racial equality, separation of church and state. But history rarely talks about the contradictions within this so-called liberal narrative. While preaching liberalism at home, America was busy supporting dictatorial and monarchical regimes in the Middle East that suppressed women's rights, killed homosexuals, and punished non-Muslims. Great Britain was teaching the world about liberalism while it drained $45 trillion from India during 173 years of colonial rule. France gifted the Statue of Liberty to America, the ultimate gift signifying liberalism, while colonizing Algeria and Indochina. Mahatma Gandhi, the messiah for equality and religious tolerance, was happy to support the Khilafat movement, ostensibly aimed at reviving the Ottoman Caliphate. So liberals, frankly, led down liberalism. What we got really was illiberal liberals. The rise of illiberal liberals was frankly accompanied by what I consider to be a rise in fundamentalism. So ask yourself this question: what is fundamentalism? I see fundamentalism as the attempt to impose a single truth on a plural world. In that sense, one can see fundamentalism in all walks of life. Religious fundamentalism is the most obvious example, but political fundamentalism or historical fundamentalism are no less dangerous. Liberalism was meant to be a solution to fundamentalism. Alas, liberals spawned their own fundamentalists. You just see what's happening all around you, and you see liberals behaving in such a fundamentalist manner. So preventing the differing historical narratives or deriding alternate political discourse are the outcomes of such fundamentalism. Now, we are often, Sharan, we are often advised to avoid treating something as a gospel truth. But when the four gospels, not even counting the Gnostic ones of the New Testament, cannot agree on a single narrative on Jesus Christ, which version will you consider to be the gospel truth? French author Bernard Le Bovier famously said, "What is history but a fable agreed upon?" History is a version of events, and the version that is penned by the victors tends to gain credence over time. As the Nazi Joseph Goebbels famously said, "Repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth." History is always colored by loyalties, beliefs, prejudices, power, and most importantly, politics. All history is distorted by the lens of the observer, and that is why I don't call it history, I call it dystory, distorted history.
Right.
Each set of historians peddles their own narrative and repeats the errors of the group that preceded it. So what is the solution?
Yes.
As it turns out, the solution in the matter of both statues and the matter of history narratives is the same. Don't be selective. Let thousands of statues stand. Let thousands of historical narratives flourish. Allow history to be understood as an inexact narration of events that is often colored by the sensibilities of the narrator. Allow all sides to have their say. It is possible that Churchill saved England from fascism, but can't it be equally true that he allowed millions of Indians to starve to death during the Bengal famine? An act which was no less horrendous than genocide. The Mughal Empire, can we not accept that it could have been extremely wealthy and powerful in absolute terms, but can't we in parallel also accept that it is possible that India's share in GDP actually fell during that period? The problem I see is selectivity. And it was George Orwell who said that he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past.
Yeah.
So while politics determines control of the present, history determines control of the past. It's about time that we freed both from the shackles of one-sided narratives. History should have taught us that, Sharan.
Right.
Alas, it was Hegel who said rather famously that the only thing that we learn from history is that we never learn from history.
Right. Lots of wisdom coming from you. And in fact, this reminds me when Dr. Tharoor was speaking at speaking in Oxford. So everybody were extremely were lauding his words, and it was a very impressive speech. But it was also important that you hear out the opposition and the proposition, right? Because that's when you hear both sides of the argument. And when I did hear the other side of the bench saying their own arguments, that is when my eyes opened up. Now, what is true, what is right, that's up to that's really subjective, and that depends on where you come from.
Sharan, the way I like to think about it is that when you go for a 3D movie, you put on a pair of 3D glasses. Yeah. And actually what is happening in that 3D movie is that there are multiple beams of light. So in other words, it's a couple of movies that are coming at you, but you are able to merge those multiple beams of light into one coherent narrative through the vision of those 3D glasses. Right. What is really required in the world of history is the ability to put on 3D glasses so that you can look at multiple narratives and you can then weigh them in order to see which one makes more sense. And is it possible that there were inherent biases that were creeping into some of those narratives? Without that, I think history becomes meaningless.
You're absolutely right. I mean, even in the case of journalism, when people, whether it's from the left or the right, again, I hate these labels, when they speak about bias or being neutral, I find that funny because it's not humanly possible to be unbiased or neutral, because you have your cognitive biases, because you read something, you come from somewhere, you live a human experience that's essentially different from the other person.
Absolutely.
So I found this very funny, but it was supposed to be a compulsory reading for us back during our journalism days. So this is something that came in, but this is a notion that I've challenged, right? But at the end of the day, journalism for me is being impartial. Whether you accept what I have to say is really up to you. But am I being impartial? Yeah. I hope so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, so all that you can hope for is that within your mind, you will hope that you will remain balanced.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is that there is no one on earth who can be truly balanced. And therefore, it is very important for those multiple perspectives to emerge so that people can make up their own minds. And that is something which I think for the last 70 odd years in the world of history, we have not allowed it to happen.
Even let's move on to something that perhaps youngsters are debating these days. And it's also happening in America, legalization of cannabis. And you've written about this. This is a hot subject, and especially because a lot of false equivalences are drawn to, Shiva and how he used to consume cannabis and things like that.
You're going to get me into trouble on this question. You will get me into trouble. So, I mean, indeed, I have written a column on this, but I'm not too sure as to whether we should be discussing this on.
No, let's talk about it in terms of policy, but not in terms of historical usages and things like that. I won't get you into trouble. So my question directly to you is: should cannabis be legalized in India, because so many other countries have started to do it? And also, since you can give us a perspective, how did ancient Bharat treat consumption of cannabis?
Okay. Should I answer your question first and then go into the details? The simple answer, it's a one-word answer to your question. Yes, it should be legalized. But obviously, that's a point of view. That's an opinion. Right. I'm sure there will be many who will argue with my opinion. Now, coming to the historical perspective on this, if we go back into our own legends, the legend has it that it was the shade of a tall cannabis plant that brought Lord Shiva relief from the blazing sun. And he was curious, so he chewed some of its leaves, and he felt so invigorated that he adopted its usage. Hence the use of cannabis in Shiva worship. Now, the plant and its forms are known by various names around the world: marijuana, Mary Jane, weed, pot, hemp, grass. In fact, I'm told that there are more than 1,000 terms, including lots of slang, for the humble cannabis, a plant that can be used in various forms. So you can imagine, I mean, something that has been given 1,000 odd names, how popular it must be. Yeah. But in India, the most common avatars are the so-called trinity of bhang, ganja, and charas. Now, bhang, of course, is a paste which is derived from grinding cannabis leaves and stems together, while ganja or weed is more potent and is made from dried flower buds of the plant. And charas, which is the most intoxicating amongst the three forms, is a resin that is obtained by rubbing the cannabis flowers for hours. The longer, the better. It is often called hashish. And it was the Nizari Ismaili militants of 11th century Persia who smoked it. And that's why they began to be called hashishin, which is the etymological root of the word assassin. Now, the earliest references to cannabis you can find from the Vedas. The Atharva Veda refers to it as one of the 5 kingdoms of herbs that release us from anxiety. Its uses have been mentioned in the Sushrut Samhita, the Bhav Prakash. There is, I think, a reference of it even in the Ashtadhyayi of Panini, which reinforces the view that cannabis was known to Indians 2,300 years ago. During the 10th century, it was called the food of the gods. 500 years later, its virtues were listed as astringency, heat, inspiration, and the capacity to eliminate wind and phlegm. In the 16th century, we have a Sanskrit play depicting 2 people quarreling before a judge. Before passing a verdict, the judge demands a payment for his decree and is readily offered bhang. The Raj Vallabh, which is a 17th century text, goes on to equate it with Amrit, the nectar of life. So for centuries, bhang has been a symbol of festivity and hospitality in India. No marriage, coronation, or harvest has been complete without it. As a holy staple, thandai is made by boiling a mixture of milk, sugar, cannabis, poppy seeds, and pepper, ginger, cloves, cardamom, and dry fruits, almond, nutmeg, rosebuds, and so on and so forth. But bhang is even found in pakoras, halwa, and pedas. Sadhus have used it from time immemorial as a means to alter spiritual consciousness. Now, rarely can you visit the banks of the Ganga without coming across a sadhu and his chilam, which is a conical smoking pipe made of clay. So cannabis has been indispensable historically, even in war. Indian folk songs from the 12th century talk about bhang as the drink of warriors. Soldiers would take a swig to eliminate any fear or panic. One such story describes the frightened soldiers of Guru Gobind Singh when he was confronted by a wild elephant with a sword that had been pierced into his trunk. Eventually, one of the soldiers consumed bhang, which gave him the courage to slip under the elephant and kill it. So, given the fact that we have such ancient connections with cannabis, I wonder why this herb has sparked so much debate and outrage in recent times. I mean, we have Canada, Mexico, South Africa, Uruguay, Georgia, and I think some parts of Australia, and I think some of the states, 18 odd states of the US, have legalized the recreational use of cannabis. Now, this was possibly prompted by a earlier study a few years ago, which found that alcohol and nicotine were far riskier than cannabis on a so-called margin of exposure basis. So the question in my mind really is that why don't we simply legalize cannabis and tax it like alcohol and tobacco? After all, in India, we earned a whopping 1.75 lakh crores in the year 2019-20 from taxes on alcohol. The Indian Exchequer collects more than 53,000 crores each year from tobacco products. Now, we don't ban those products. I mean, in some states we have prohibition, but we don't ban those products nationally. We simply make them very expensive for consumers. And currently, the so-called Narcotics, Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act frames India's regulations around cannabis. And while the act prohibits the sale and use of cannabis resin and its flowers, it permits the use of the seeds, stems, and leaves. So in effect, bhang is legal while ganja and charas are illegal. But does that really make sense? Because think about this logically. The alcohol content of beer, wine, vodka, and whiskey, they vary widely. For beer, it's around 5%, wine is at 12%, vodka is approximately 40%, and whiskey is around 40 or 45%. But do we make one legal and the other illegal because of the potency? Yeah. So the way I like to really think about this entire debate, there was this judge, this law professor who was also a member of the Mississippi legislature. And he was once asked about his position on whiskey. His name was Noah Sweat. And he gave the most beautiful reply. He said, if when you say whiskey, you mean the devil's brew, the poison scourge, the bloody monster that defiles innocence, dethrones reason, then my friend, I am opposed to it with every fiber of my being. However, if by whiskey you mean the oil of conversation, the philosophic wine, the elixir of life, the ale that is consumed when good fellows get together, then my friend, I'm absolutely and unequivocally in favor of it. Isn't it time for us to take an equally balanced view on something like this? I mean, so I'll just leave it there.
In fact, this reminds me about around the time when Ronald Reagan was in power and when America launched the war on drugs campaign, right? And you could see Nancy Reagan becoming somehow the mother figure for everybody in America because she led the advertising campaigns, at least against the consumption of drugs. Now, I think that is around the time when a lot of states around the world as well were sort of forced to criminalize a lot of these psychotropic substances as well. So there is definitely a need to relook at it. Now that we are again somehow speaking about geopolitics, it is impossible for us to conclude without talking about China. And China has been in the news of late.
We also should cover one important aspect related to the temples. So we can circle back to that.
Sure, we'll come to that. So how should India manage its relationship with China, especially because of the incursions, because of salami slicing, because of the tensions that we've been having? Historically, perhaps it was different, would you say?
Well, I mean, we are now defining our relationship, unfortunately, in the context of what happened first in Doklam and then Galwan. And those incidents, unfortunately, are a stark reminder of how complicated the relationship between the so-called elephant and the so-called dragon is. But I wonder, why does the relationship need to be so complex? A multitude of experts have weighed in on the issue. Some of them say that China is diverting attention from its own domestic troubles. Others say that China wishes to establish its Asian dominance, and is thus prodding India, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Australia in a multitude of ways. Yet another group believes that India is equally responsible for the mess that it finds itself in because of a lack of consistent China policy over the decades. Now, as I see it, the problem is that India sees the relationship's history only through the prism of 1950 and thereafter. That was the year in which the People's Liberation Army took over Tibet, and subsequently, of course, Aksai Chin also. And then the relationship began deteriorating. The two countries then went to war in 1962. And of course, India was hopelessly unprepared. The war lasted just a month, but almost around 1,400 Indian soldiers and about half that number of Chinese soldiers died. Thousands were wounded. Around 3,900 Indian soldiers were captured and taken prisoner by the Chinese. The 1962 war was followed by several other border skirmishes, including the 1967 clash at Nathula, which of course India decisively won. The 1987 face-off in Sumdorong-Chu, the 2017 battle for Doklam, and of course the most recent one in Galwan. Quite naturally, the mere mention of China gets India's hackles up. But China sees its foreign relationships in the context of a much older prism, and it's a much wider prism. 3,000 years ago, the Zhao monarchs believed that their empire occupied the middle of the earth. Hence, China was called Zhonggao, or Middle Kingdom, glorious empire surrounded by barbarians. So, subjugation of the barbarians was a sacred duty. Other kings would necessarily have to submit to Chinese hegemony for this construct to work. An alliance between China and India, by definition, would have to be one of master and vassal under the Middle Kingdom approach. But China's foreign policy and military maneuvers are not only based on their Middle Kingdom approach, but are also influenced by Sun Tzu, who we spoke about earlier. Sun Tzu says that all warfare is based on deception. When able, we should seem unable. When we are in action, we should seem inactive. When near, we should seem far. When far, the enemy should think we are near. So, unfortunately, as we know, China did not forget its history and its ancient wisdom. Unfortunately, somewhere along the line, India did. So, if China can look to Sun Tzu, India, of course, has Kautilya, whose strategic and economic views are no less profound. If Kautilya says that if the ends can be achieved by non-military methods, even by methods of intrigue, duplicity, and fraud, an armed conflict is not advised. Any activity which harms the progress of the enemy engaged in similar undertakings is also to be considered progress. But most importantly, Kautilya's Arthashastra emphatically says that the prosperous one becomes the victorious one. Why did we pay no heed to this fundamental truth? India's prism honestly needs to change. India's linkages with China go back centuries. I was very surprised when I was writing The Vault of Vishnu. I realized that it was a Pallava prince, Bodhi Dharma, who took South Indian martial arts such as Kalari Payattu and Silambam to Shaolin, thus resulting in a new technique that came to be known as Kung Fu. Similarly, Buddhism traveled from India to the White Horse Temple in Loyang and then spread not only within China, but also to the rest of the world. Chanakya's Arthashastra talks of Chinese silk that was imported into India and was highly valued. The traveler Wanzang not only was enthralled by his stint at the world-famous Nalanda University, but he was also ecstatic to taste sugar candies that he had never experienced before. Though through the British, China gave us tea. Why did we fight wars with China for most of history? Well, the part of the reason is that the Himalayas gave us natural protection. But our economic strength historically played a vital role. In 1960, the Chinese GDP at $2010 was $128.3 billion. India's GDP in that year was $148.8 billion, significantly higher than that of China. But China overtook India in 1978 when its GDP became 293.6 billion compared to India's 293.2. So effectively, the countries had almost equal GDP by 1978. But after that, the gap between India and China only kept worsening. By 2019, China's GDP was almost around 5.5. 2021 actually was about 5.5 times that of India. Successive governments in India thought that they could fight Chinese aggression through military or diplomatic means, completely ignoring the fact that economic imbalance would be our undoing. I have always believed, Sharan, that India is a land of thinkers, but we slip up terribly on execution. This is fundamentally what separates us from our Asian neighbors, such as Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Malaysia, that pull themselves out of destruction or poverty by simply following the philosophy of that famous shoemaker Nike, which says, just do it. I really thought that, COVID-19 and the pandemic was the perfect opportunity, really, for the elephant to face the dragon. So India has taken bold decisions when faced with a crisis. And this was the perfect crisis to spur bold and transformative thinking that can allow us to leapfrog and set the balance right. So everything that India needs to do in the context of China is already known to us. We don't need fancy consultants to tell us. We simply need people to get it done. Cut bureaucracy down to the bone, make tax compliance simple and easy, use out-of-the-box solutions for education and healthcare, cut the pendency of litigation, modernize the police machinery, push harder on urban infrastructure, untangle the plethora of rules and regulations that hold back entrepreneurship. And, so if you do all of that, then in effect, what you're going to achieve is a greater level of prosperity. And as Kautilya says, the prosperous one ends up becoming the victorious one. I would like to remind you that there is an old proverb which says that elephants cannot run, but science has recently determined that elephants use a trick called Groucho to reach speeds of 25 kilometers per hour. So even though their 4 feet never leave the ground simultaneously, elephants manage to bounce around their center of mass, much like an exaggerated walk. So it's time that we start getting the elephant to experiment with new ways to run. That is the only way that we can deal with China.
Absolutely. The Asian tigers are already roaring. It's probably time for us to catch up with the rest of the world. And I hope that happens with time.
The way I would like to say it is that we think that we are fighting the dragon, that is the Chinese, but the real dragons that we need to fight are within India. We need to fight all the things that are holding back the economy and make it so globally competitive that that the entire context of China falls into the background.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that detailed explanation, Ashwinji. And before we wrap up, I'd like to ask you your thoughts on Free Hindu Temples movement. And this is something you mentioned earlier as well. Now, again, not going into the debates very deeply, there has been a colonial legacy of keeping Hindu temples in particular under government control. So why is it actually important for today's temples to be freed from the state control, according to you?
Well, frankly, the answer to this, Sharan, should be obvious. The most glaring example of religious inequality is the so-called Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Act, 1959. So this is a Tamil Nadu act. And of course, there are different acts of a similar nature that have been enacted by state governments. And mind you, that includes BJP ones across India. So essentially, these acts give state governments the power to exercise control over the finances of over 4 lakh Hindu places of worship, while leaving out government control on mosques, churches, and gurdwaras. Now, prior to British rule, Hindu temples were administered and managed by local communities or rulers. Temple wealth was used to promote art, culture, schools, cow shelters, rest houses, dispensaries, local charities. But then the British decided to milk these fabulously wealthy temples through various acts and legislations. So in 1925, they introduced what was known as the Madras Religious and Charitable Endowments Act that brought all religious establishments under government control. But this law resulted in vocal opposition from Indian minorities. And so the act was then redrafted in order to exclude Muslim, Christian, and Parsi places of worship. And that same year, the Sikh Gurdwara Act was passed in order to bring the Sikh places of worship under a Sikh council. In effect, government control was only left in place on Hindu temples. Now, after independence, one would have imagined that the government would have found a way to ensure that Hindu temples were managed by the Hindu community. Instead, the Tamil Nadu government passed the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Act in 1959, and under which the Hindu temples now came under a commissioner. This was followed by most South states passing similar legislation. So, for example, in Tamil Nadu, about 44,000 temples are controlled by the government, the state government. Andhra Pradesh, I'm told that they are now planning to change the law, but as of today, Andhra Pradesh is not far behind because it controls about 33,000 temples. In fact, there are 15 Indian states that have acts that legalize this religious discrimination. The avowed intent of such legislation was to avoid mismanagement and misappropriation of assets by temple authorities. But then consider this. Recently, I think it was last year probably, the Madras High Court had to ask the state government to explain how 47,000 acres of temple land had gone missing from the records of the state. So management of temples by government is nothing short of institutionalized plunder. So taking up this temple issue, I would like to sort of put before you the fact that there are a couple of things that we definitely need to do in order to preserve the sanctity of secularism in India. Number one, the government must give up control of Hindu temples. It was Prime Minister Modi who once said that the government has no business to be in business. I would add that the government has no business to be in temples, mosques, churches, gurdwaras, synagogues, or fire temples. Government control of Hindu temples is frankly a festering wound on the skin of secularism. We ignore true secularism at our own peril because it is precisely such perceived hurt that encourages communalism. In a world characterized by flourishing extremist ideologies, I don't think we need any more. So my personal view is that this is a burning issue and it needs immediate addressing.
It is getting a lot of traction, and thank you for putting it so beautifully. In fact, this is the kind of a treatment that is meted out by the Indian state, which is why we are known as a nanny state as well, very popularly, because the state decides how to treat its citizens, how they need to behave, and somehow it's intrinsically within us to follow that and accept the definition of secularism. Otherwise, we are not secular in nature. Is the implication, of what it means.
But this freeing of temples, Sharan, must go hand in hand. It must go hand in hand with a uniform civil code. We definitely now have reached the point where we need a UCC that would define the framework for marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption, maintenance. After all, the Indian government did pass the Hindu Marriage Act, the Hindu Succession Act, the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, the Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act. All of these were passed in the 1950s. Just to give you an example, when the when the goods and services tax was introduced in India, the government coined the slogan, "One nation, one tax." Then what's wrong with the idea of one nation, one civil code? After all, various religious groups ceded their authority in the spheres of criminal law, contract law, evidence law. All of these, they ceded their authority to a common law that is now applied to every citizen, irrespective of religion. So, in fact, we know that the UCC has already been spelled out in the directive principles of state policy. Now, on several occasions, Indian courts have also been reminding the government of the desirability of a UCC. So, in my opinion, both these issues have to go hand in hand: a uniform civil code and a return of places of worship to the original communities.
Rightly said. And in fact, I don't know who said this, but in the last 2 days, especially since the hijab is going on, I heard somebody saying, the only privilege that Hindus can perhaps enjoy sometime in the future is to demand for equality. And that's the only privilege you get as a community. And that kind of struck me, because usually we are thrown around these terms such as majoritarian mandate and majoritarian dictatorship and whatnot. So it's actually a matter that's laughable, perhaps, when you closely and holistically examine things on the ground. Ashwinji, thank you so much for joining us. It was lovely having this conversation with you. We've spoken about so many things, and including your own writings about Chanakya, about geopolitics, about Kashmir and free Hindu temples. This has been a lovely podcast and an interview. Thank you so much, and I hope you can join us again in the future.
Thank you, Sharan. Please keep doing what you are doing, and I was delighted to be here. And thank you for the very, very insightful questions, because sometimes if the questions aren't great, you're not going to end up getting great answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, and have a good day.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.